I began my own work on what was to become called the blockchain in the spring of 1989, fully 19 years before the publication of the Bitcoin paper. And while I lay no claim to the many innovations that have been built on top of the work that Stuart Haber and I did, I'm grateful to have played a small role in the early stages. As a result, it's hard to name my talk anything other than blockchain the long view. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, if some guy did work on a technology 30 years ago, and you start to apply the depreciation schedule that's associated with most assets, then by now his work would be essentially worthless. On the other hand, there is another possibility, namely that by having a long historical perspective on the development of this technology and its social impact, that perhaps I'm in a position to say something useful about where things may be headed. You're going to have to decide which of those two possibilities comes to fruition after listening to this talk. It's fitting that being here in Malta at the Blockchain Summit, that we talk about a little known incident related to the Siege of Malta. Now, 450 years ago, slightly to the east and south of where we're located this minute, Malta was under siege. And times were desperate enough that the silver and gold bullion ships that attempted to land at the port could not unload their cargo. They could not enter the port. And the situation became desperate in terms of printing coinage for the state of Malta. As a result, a new coin was issued in brass or copper, some baser metal other than silver or gold, with the following inscription: Non ies sed fides. Now, for those of you that didn't major in Latin as undergraduates, that's not the metal, but rather the trust. And in a sense, I think that goes to the heart of what the blockchain is all about, as we supersede a reliance on particular institutions and particular physical objects and instead replace it with a peer-to-peer trust among peoples. So with that as a beginning, let me go to the presentation I had in mind. I first found out about Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin paper because I received unsolicited mail, email and regular postal mail from people that I don't believe I had ever met. And the substance of these mails was always, gee, I read the Satoshi paper. I see that of the 8 footnotes in the paper, that 3 refer directly to your work and 1 refers indirectly. And I also happen to know that because I Googled you, that you served a mission in Japan and therefore are fluent in Japanese. And so I was just wondering whether you were in fact Satoshi. I do get that from time to time, and I've always responded in the same way, namely, Watashi wa Satoshi Nakamoto de wa arimasen. I don't know how to put it any more clearly than that. But I have been deeply influenced by Japanese culture and have a lot of admiration for it, and it's the reason that when we were founding a venture capital firm and looking for a name, we chose a classic Japanese word, yugen, which can be taken to mean deep insight or profound understanding. We don't claim to have that, but we claim to aspire to it. And as a result, I've formed my presentation today in the form of a modified Japanese haiku. My story about the blockchain describes an ancient problem and how it found a digital answer, creating opportunity, but with the question of how to proceed wisely. So let's take each of those 4 topics in turn. An ancient problem. This is a depiction of a scene described in the Bible several thousand years ago. 2 neighboring tribes in dispute over a land issue finally come together, settle the dispute, and to memorialize it, they construct a pile of stones that leading members of both tribes are witnesses to as signifying the border. And this modest event captures quite well what is needed to build a sound social system. Namely, whenever a contract is concluded, an agreement between people, we need both witnesses and a record. And finding the solution to witnesses and durable records is really the problem the blockchain is trying to address. It's very interesting if you look into the history of records of agreements between peoples. But for brevity of time, I want to just focus on one historical example, and that is the indenture. Now, most people are familiar with the notion of an indentured servant, but the actual word indenture refers to the contract, a general contract, and its etymology goes to the word dental or teeth. And here's why. This is actually a contract written in triplicate. Here's one copy, another, and another. And then you see this edge between the 3 identical documents. Well, the idea was to tear the document along these edges and create a kind of set of interlocking teeth. Namely, a random tear can be shown to match an authentic copy of the same contract only because these jagged edges line up just perfectly. And that's a way of preserving evidence of the authenticity of the various copies of the contract. Well, as I said, back in 1989, I began to worry about this issue. How are we going to create durable artifacts in a digital age? Or to put it in a different way, how will we create a digital tear in the fabric of digital records? And having done that, who will be the witnesses? This depicts a much younger version of me and my colleague, Dr. Haber, back at part of the old Bell Labs, Bell Communications Research, back in 1990. And it's a story about the work that we did to solving that issue of coming up with a digital tear in fabric. What you see on the left are the references from the Bitcoin paper to the work of those days. And what it really came down to was we tried to create an immutable record, and we had made a fair progress on it, but it still required us to trust someone, trust some sort of centralized authority. And we really wanted to see if there wasn't a way to create a system that didn't require us to trust a centralized authority, because it would make the records obviously more authentic. But we finally, in despair, decided that that was impossible, and so the next best thing we could do would be to create a proof that one could not create a record without having to trust someone. And in fact, in the midst of the proof is when we stumbled across the solution. So we were making this attempt to prove that it couldn't be done, and I was standing in line at a local restaurant waiting for a table local to the place where both Stuart and I work. And the problem we were grappling with was the fact that if 2 parties colluded on something, then it would take a third party to be a witness to the fact that they were conspiring. And then it would always be possible to corrupt that third party and in the conspiracy, and then you'd need a fourth party to be the witness to uncover the conspiracy, and so on and so on, reductio ad absurdum. I was realizing that the reason we couldn't avoid a trusted third party was that in order to avoid that problem, we would essentially have to have the entire world in on the collusion or the conspiracy. And it was at that point that I realized that that was in fact not the problem but the solution, namely by inverting the problem and making the entire world a witness to the record keeping, or in more modest terms, making the entire community of users a witness to the record keeping, that we could in fact eliminate the need to trust a centralized authority. I'd like to actually build a blockchain right now, and for those of you that are listening to this, just to clarify the context of the Malta Blockchain Summit where I initially presented this work, we did go ahead and at that summit created a version of the original system that Stuart and I had conceived of, a distributed chain of blocks with a backbone to take predictions that 321 members from the audience made. Now, the particular task we chose for the audience to make it kind of interesting was, on the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Bitcoin paper, we took $1,000, split it into 3 parts, and bought $333 worth of Bitcoin, $333.33 worth of Ether, and $333.33 worth of Ripple. And I then asked the audience to participate in the construction of this blockchain by making their own estimate of what the price of those 3 currencies would be in 1 year's time. And that constitutes the 321 submissions that we received in building this chain of blocks. The durability of the system, the immutability of the records, is demonstrated by taking one of the example receipts that was issued, in this case, the one that was issued to me in creating the Genesis block, and requesting that it be validated, that the blockchain community validate the accuracy of my receipt and therefore my Genesis block. And what happens when you do that is the system randomly selects 3 members of the community who each have their own copy, their own independent copy of the blockchain, thus created, and therefore are in a position to select against that to validate my receipt. What happens is each individual in turn will compare my receipt that they've received at random against their own copy of the blockchain for the entire community, perform the validation, and in this case determine that the receipt is valid, and in doing so receiving a surety token. We just go in to simulate what it's like for the other 2 randomly selected viewers to also have received the receipt, compared it against their copy, their individual independent copy of the blockchain, performed the validation, and then that validation notion is circulated amongst the community. I'm just going to conclude with the 3rd person doing the same task. Again, each of these people have their own independent copy of the blockchain distributed to them, and so the individual users of the system are become nodes in the blockchain community. And what you can see is that all 3 people have come back saying the receipt is valid. Now, suppose, on the other hand, I had decided to change my price in predicting the value of the Ether from, let's say, $6,450 to $16,450. Now I send out that same validation request to the community. Again, 3 people are chosen at random to do the validation. Although it was a bit of an inside joke at the conference why it is that my devoted wife was selected at random both times. No, I will neither confirm nor deny that she wasn't selected at random. At any rate, we can now go to the system. A new receipt has been received, a new request to this person's independent blockchain, and we see, when performing the validation, that it is in fact invalid. This is not determined by any central authority, but by the independent local copy of the blockchain against which it's measured. And similarly, these other two participants perform the same validation, determine again that what I've sent is a fake, and the last participant as well can do the same. Each receives, as you can see, a surety token in exchange for their help to the community. And the blockchain has rejected my tampered document, proving the immutability or demonstrating the immutability of the system. For those of you that wonder why we chose the name Gazillion for the demonstration, well, I don't want to give that away, but we'll be discussing that over the course of the next year. But I will give you one hint, and that is we chose the name Gazillion because Google is not the only large number. I won't say anything more than that. Returning to the presentation, let's see where that brings us. Again, what we have is a set of records that are interlinked and then widely distributed. Interlinked, of course, through the mechanism of a computationally infeasible to reverse engineer one-way hash function. And then we distribute those records widely through the community and provide incentives for the records to be kept for validation purposes. Now, again, we didn't call that a blockchain. Of course, I think many that have read the Bitcoin paper know that neither did Satoshi call his work a blockchain. But it's hard to think of what else to describe it other than a chain of connected blocks. And so it's a little hard to avoid that word blockchain. Now, having said that, I am happy to concede that what we have here is what I would call the early or proto-blockchain. And yet it shares quite a bit in common with the hundreds of varieties of blockchain that have since been created. Again, in the sense that the records are linked through computationally infeasible to reverse engineer one-way hash functions, and then widely distributed amongst the community, decentralizing the trust and removing the need to put anyone in a position of excessive power or control. The hundreds of blockchains differ amongst themselves and from our earlier primitive blockchain in three dimensions. Where should computation be done? Who should be in control of that computation, and what reward or incentives should be provided to the community for maintaining and validating the records. And it's really along these three dimensions that all the variety and opportunity of this design space lies. We could talk just about these three issues for quite some time, so I'm just going to leave that as a placeholder for a longer discussion. But having done that, let's take a look at what opportunity is provided, as well as what cautions we should consider in moving forward. I'd like to provide 5 predictions for the future, 5 insights that I think the long trajectory of my blockchain involvement has led me to conclude, and then 3 cautions to those that are trying to make their way in the blockchain space. So let's look at each of those things in turn. 1, I think it's easy to forget in all of the excitement about the more revolutionary nature of the blockchain that one thing that it definitely can do in the here and now with existing corporations and enterprises is increase the transparency and integrity of those operations. Okay? The audit function itself is something that precludes a backdating of records and the premeditated tampering with records. I cite an example here on the left of a company called Lending Club, where it was found that certain loans had been altered after the fact and then backdated, and it led to a 70% rapid decline in the market capitalization of the company. Clearly, that company would have been in a better position if it had used the blockchain for its loan records. I cite another example of the Federal Reserve, which keeps minutes for each of its meetings, but doesn't disclose them until quite a bit of time afterwards. What's necessary to vouchsafe for the integrity of those minutes, even though they're long delayed in their disclosure, is the benefit that the blockchain can confer on those. And we'll be talking later in the year about a not-for-profit foundation that myself, the other co-inventor of the early blockchain, and some of the leading corporations involved in it, about a nonprofit foundation that we formed, the Blockchain Corporate Governance Foundation, to raise the level of transparency and integrity in the corporate and institutional world by use of the blockchain. So I think that's one pretty sure prediction. Let me make a second. Let me just observe that the real promise, one of the real promises of the blockchain, is that if you have a shared ledger, then reconciliation time and effort is reduced to zero. This is something that has been a little slow in gaining traction, and I could go into the many reasons why that's taken longer than expected, but we are starting, in fact, to see traction there. This article on the left is a recent one that shows that Walmart will be working with their supply chain so that produce that makes its way to Walmart is documented on the blockchain, so that in the event of say a E. coli outbreak or something, the reconciliation time to track down where the produce originally came from can be reduced to essentially zero. There are similar things I could talk about, the IBM Maersk deal and others, and the movement of land titles to reduce title registration issues to a zero clearing time as well. Let's go on with the third. This one gets a little more controversial, but I would like to suggest for the record that all my experience tells me that notice has been served for fiat currencies. Now, that does not in the least bit mean that that's something that's going to happen tomorrow. As you can see on the left, there are certainly those who feel that nothing like this is going to happen, that the cryptocurrencies we see today will with almost certainty come to a bad ending, said by someone who claims to be a very wealthy individual. But I'll let his track record speak for itself. On the other hand, we have Christine Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund saying change is coming, real change is coming, and we need to prepare for it. I frankly think that both of these parties could be quite right. Without meaning to disparage the early entrants into the cryptocurrency space, there are flaws that need fixing. And so I think it's really quite wide open as to what becomes fiat currency. But I think there's an inevitability, either with improved versions of the existing leaders or with new entrants, that we will see fiat currencies seeing competition. And why is that? You know, a lot has been written about store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account, all sorts of things about whether they need to be asset-backed or not. But fundamentally, what it comes down to is this observation from a member of the St. Louis regional part of the United States Federal Reserve, who says when it really comes down to it, all money is just a ledger. And so with immutable records, we have the ability to create such a ledger to the extent that we engender a community that has trust in it. Well, then and there we've got money, so long as that ledger is a transfer of debt, essentially. Let's go on to prediction number 4. I think tokens are the evolution of equity. Now, again, on the left side, I recognize that there are many early efforts that have been both widely praised and criticized. It all depends on whether you did your ICO already or not and have benefited from the earlier liquidity that it brings. But I think for the long term, this is inevitable, that we're going to see a kind of equity plus plus that is token based. I think we'll see those tokens move more to the securitization side. And I think we'll see an enormous number of additional assets move onto the blockchain. Fifth and final prediction, in a sense the most far-reaching one from my perspective, and that is the change in the nature of the firm. Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for his 1937 paper, The Nature of the Firm, was, in my mind, the first to crystallize why it is that corporations even exist. And I don't want to go into that, but it has to do with the notion of transaction cost, broadly considered. What I'd like to suggest is that the token-incentivized ecosystem may well become a kind of semi-permeable membrane that extends farther out beyond the boundaries of existing corporations today and becomes the new unit of market efficiency. Two examples worth noting, though there are many others I could cite, are the subjective proof of work that Steemit is experimenting with, and how members of the community determine how much value is being created by different other members, and trying to see that that value creation aligns well with the apportioning of actual value in token. I think that is a lion that is about to roar. Also worth considering in this same spirit, the nature of LinkedIn, which I assume a vast majority of this audience participates in. LinkedIn was sold to Microsoft for something like $26.2 billion. And at the time of the sale, I wonder why many of us in the audience didn't look around at each other and say, wait a minute, I'm the one that created all the value for LinkedIn by having all the network connections. Where's my part of that $26 billion? I think that is a highly suggestive incident, and it's worth pondering why the value creation doesn't follow the value allocation. Those are 5 predictions about where I think things are headed. Let's look at 3 cautionary concerns for those either trying to make an entrepreneurial go of things in the blockchain space, or equally for those that are investing in those entrepreneurs. First, for those who are somewhat skeptical, and I hold myself among them, remember the mortar shell. What does that mean? Well, I had a friend in the Army who once told me a story about mortar shells. Apocryphal or otherwise, I really like it. He said, the mortar shell is a very primitive, crude sort of weapon. The first mortar that gets fired at you is so laughably short that it's not even worth commenting on. The second mortar that's fired at you is so comfortably long that you don't really need to worry about it. And then the third mortar shell, you're dead. Well, what's the point? The point is primitive things improve rapidly. And for some, looking at the foibles and faults of Bitcoin is seen as sufficient reason to dismiss the entire blockchain space. They would be making a very risky decision if they were basing things only on the early entrants. Now, I'm not suggesting that Bitcoin and Ether are mortar shells that have missed the mark, but what I am, and that something better than them is going to be the one that is the real killer, if you will, because obviously both of these cryptocurrencies are undergoing their own evolution. But what I am suggesting to critics is that they not mistake the first effort for just how rapidly the situation can be improved, particularly considering the tremendous amount of talent that has poured into this space. It's really remarkable. Second, consider the nature of revolution. this is a cautionary tale for those that may be perhaps overly enthusiastic about the space. And that is, I think many get caught up in the philosophical promise of a uh, Gini coefficient gone to the perfect number, or a world where there are no central authorities or authorities of any nature, where everyone is free. And while I certainly hold some of those libertarian aspirations myself personally, that alone is not going to get us there. And those that want to make the push to solely make a business pitch solely on the face of or on the strength of this idea that this changes everything and therefore this time it's different, I can tell you that it is highly unlikely that your efforts are going to prove successful. Instead, what one needs is a combination of revolutionary outlook and incremental application. And so, for investors and entrepreneurs alike, I suggest something a little more modest, namely, follow the representative revenue. Third and final thought today is that we could all do to practice some humility. It's so easy to form judgments one way or another about an opportunity or about the entire space and then defend it in the face of contradictory facts. Whereas, as Sir Francis Bacon pointed out so many hundred years ago in helping to define the scientific method, it is those that begin not claiming to fully understand or to be certain about the outcome who eventually prosper, as their humility leads them to deeper exploration, a willingness to change or pivot depending on how the facts develop, and that's where real success comes. So if you'd remember the mortar shell, if you'd reflect on the nature of revolution, and if you'd practice humility, I think the prospects are bright. Again, it's breathtaking to myself and to Stuart to see just how much innovation has been done on something that we started in a rather modest way. And as I've said repeatedly, I make no claim to have thought of the many wonderful innovations that have taken place since our original work. But I will say for the record that Stuart and I feel quite grateful for the fact that we were able to be there early on. And I will attest to you that we have laid a secure foundation, one that I hope we all can prosper on top of. Thank you.